So this week we're going to start with a technique known as planar analysis. I'm going to dive into it much more in depth over there. If I were in your shoes, I'd take some notes because this is probably something completely and utterly new to you. This is a technique by which we are going to draw from observation of much more complex object, many of which that are out there are made up of some of the more simpler forms that you've been drawing thus far, that sort of are put together, if you will, combined to make these more Somebody go ahead and open that door for me. You see the sign on the door? Okay, because I'm going to start closing and locking that door, and no matter how many people knock, we're not coming in. This has become a thing in this class. All right. So we're going to take those more complex objects and apply to them a technique which treats the surfaces of those objects like what we've been doing thus far in class, where we're thinking about flat, two-dimensional shapes or planes put into relationship with one another to create an illusion of three-dimensional space, to give us the impression of surfaces that punch outward in space toward us, push inward in space away from us, planes that give us the indication of an object being round, planes that give us the indication of an object having a concave surface, planes that give us the sense of the interior of that bowl curving down and inward, things of that nature. It's planar analysis. I guess I'll use this purple marker. Planar analysis, that root word being plane. So, the definition would be essentially simplifying complex and curved surfaces of objects into flat planes drawn with straight lines. As simple as that. These drawings then are meant to help the student or the person creating one of these drawings to get a stronger sense of the underlying structure of what you may be drawing, to get an idea of how it exists in three-dimensional space and how you could portray that on the page. And the resulting drawing is, as it says there, very analytical. Right? This is one time when you are going to kind of use your brain a bit to think about how can I portray that particular surface. An artist to look at would be Luca Cambiaso. He's one of our earliest ones where we're going to see this technique being used. Luca Cambiaso was a high Renaissance Italian artist. We're talking, 1500s thereabout. And if you look at his paintings, they're fine. They're about what you expect from the Italian Renaissance. His paintings aren't necessarily what's going to help you here. If you look him up, you want to look up his drawings. They look very different from his paintings. His paintings, like if you think about any Renaissance painting you've ever seen, Luca Cambiaso's stuff looks about like that. But you get to his drawings, and Luca Cambiaso is doing this thing where in his drawings he's doing these preparatory sketches for ideas that he has for paintings, and he wants to make sure that everything within it is going to make sense in the space that he's going to be using. And so rather than drawing people as we appear, he's going to do things like, all right, there's the side of somebody's head, there's the front of their head, that's their face. He'll be, all right, shoulder coming out this way, here's body, got an arm coming out like this. And then he wants us to maybe understand that this arm is coming outward toward us. So he puts some planes in place that make us understand that that's what's happening. You know, legs. He'll give us like the planes that make up the two sides of the leg, and then maybe a plane for the knee, and then bend it downward like that. And he's doing these things to sort of think about how that human being is going to exist in space. And he's thinking about these planes very similarly to how we've been thinking about them so far in class. So that, say, if he wants to draw a person who's standing above our eye level, well, he's going to be thinking about things like, okay, well, the head then should be foreshortened like so that I'm looking at the bottom of it, right? And the torso should be coming down at me like this here, right? He's thinking about the fact that we're now looking up, and those planes are helping us to understand that we're down below looking up. Now, this is an even more simplified version of what we're going to do. We're going to be a bit more analytical, a bit more strict with our planes. We're going to continue to use the ruler for a while as well. So, ways of thinking about and doing this. I should have given myself an extra sheet. I'm going to come back to this one. Give myself an extra sheet first to do some playing around. Now, we've already been dealing with planar objects, right? We already took things like cubes and broke them up into a series of planes to give the illusion of three-dimensional space. That's what we have been doing. But now, if I've got something like, say, let's say I've got that cylinder. Right? I've got a cylinder that I'm needing to draw. But I want to break it up into planes. What I've got to think about instead now is a series of straight line planes that take advantage of this kind of language, but give me the feeling of a rounded object. Because I'm taking advantage of foreshortening to give the impression that this plane is closer to me, and these two planes are going away from me in space. Right? Giving the impression of then a curved surface that's in front of me. Or the other way around. If I take that same set of planes and come like this. And now if this is below my eye level, it gives me the impression that these are coming toward me in space, and that line is away from me. As if it was, I don't know, like one of those trifolds that you used for your science fair back in high school, right? Where this part right here is upright and flat, and there are two parts that are coming outward toward me in space. I could continue that outward like so, right? And continue this illusion that there's three dimensions happening here, when in reality, I'm drawing flat two-dimensional shapes, but putting them in relationship with one another to give the feeling that I've got surfaces that are undulating, going in, out, all of that. So, out there, we've got a lot of different types of objects, some of which are already planar. And pretty much as long as you get the planes that you can see, you're in good shape. Things like, say, a book. A book is already pretty planar. If I just get the lines together that make up that book, let's not try to do it like that. Let's put it over here. All right? I get like my top cover, right? My bottom cover, the pages in between. And then there's kind of like that bit back there on the book. All right? Pretty planar. The illusion is already there. Where the struggle comes in is when we have an object that's not so easy to know where those planes are. And we have to do a little bit of analysis and thinking about it. So, coming back to, then, the page that I have here. I'm going to imagine that sitting in front of me is this like wide-brimmed like church lady hat. You know, the kind that that old ladies wear at church with the bowl up here and the big wide brim. And if that's lying down flat on a surface that's below my eye level, right? It's below my eye level, so I can see the big brim here, but then where it goes back behind the actual bowl of the hat, I can't get back there and see that. All right, that's a round surface, that bowl. And the brim itself is a much more flat surface, but it's going away from me in space. And so I'm going to want to try to communicate all that through my drawing. So we're going to do this. Oh, I should have. Now I'll put the steps up here. We're going to do this in a multi-step process. Step 1, using your 2B and working very lightly. And I'm going to use this word for now, though we'll use a different word for it later. I'll say sketchy. We're going to use a different word for that around about midterm so that we can get that word out of our vocabulary. All right, we're just going to block in the composition. I'll talk about what that means in a moment. Notice I didn't mention the ruler there. This is to give us something that we're going to build the ruler drawing on top of. Second, you'll get your 4B out and your ruler. And you're going to draw contours. I'll talk about what contours mean in a moment. Step 1, step 2, 3. We're going to go back to our 2B and our ruler. And we're going to draw planes. And lastly, coming in with our 4B and 6B and the ruler, and thinking about our line variation. I'm going to show you what each of these steps looks like here in a moment, so don't worry too much. Don't worry too much if any of what I've written up here doesn't make sense to you yet. Okay, so like it said up on the board earlier, when you get out there to draw, I'm going to want you to choose a collection of 3 to 4 objects that are near one another that make an interesting composition in your mind, and that that looks good from whatever position. Like if you're standing, I like the way that looks when I'm standing. I like the way this looks when I'm sitting, what have you. And I want you to draw whatever immediately surrounds them. And you've noticed in the drawings that we looked at, it wasn't as if those objects were just floating in space. Whatever was immediately surrounding them was brought in too. So that if I was interested in, say, this phone, this saw blade, and this jug just behind it, I'd want to scale them up so that that's what's going to fit on my page. But I'm also going to include this little bit of fabric that's going to come into the picture. I may have to include this apple because it's just a little sliver of it that I can see coming out from behind this jug. I'd want to include these other little folds of fabric around it. There's this electrical plug right here that I would want to include as well, just like you saw in those. So you'll find that grouping of 3 to 4 objects, but they should be together. You're not like choosing and picking. You're not like, all right, I like this clock up here. I like this cup way down here. And then I like that candle way down there. Right? Those are from 3 different places. I want you to find a grouping that looks like an interesting composition that are together. And then your first step in this process, and understand I don't expect you to have a finished drawing at the end of the day. Today is drawing. You'll continue on Thursday. You're going to block in your composition with very light, and as I said, we're going to call them sketchy for now. We'll call them gestural later, but sketchy marks, just blocking in your composition. You're not worrying about your line work because you're going to cover it up with the ruler marks anyway. What you are being careful about is reaching out and getting your proportions, your perspective, thinking about your placement, things like that. So if I had this out in front of me, I'd be doing things like taking measurements of how tall is this versus how wide. If there was any perspective, I'd be trying to get that. And then I'm just going to very lightly, and not being perfect at all, sketching it out. If I make a mistake, it doesn't matter because I'm drawing really lightly, and I'm going to cover it up anyway. If I make a mistake, I just keep trying until the line that I need is in there somewhere. And then I get the bowl of this big hat in place. Right? And then if I had more objects, I'd continue working with those. Taking my measurements and being like, is this as tall as it should be versus how wide? How big should this other object be? What's the perspective? Where should it be placed? Things of that nature. Right? I do my entire drawing that way. Not just one object and then go through all the steps and then draw another object and go through all the steps and then another object and go through all the steps. I'm going to do my entire drawing in step 1. So I'm done with it. I don't have to go back to it. Then I move on to step 4. I'm sorry, step 2. I was looking at the word 4B. Where I'll get my 4B. The reason I'm getting my 4B is because these lines then will be darker and they'll stand out from what I've just drawn. And I'm going to go around the contours. What are contours? Contours are the lines that go around the very outside membrane, if you will, of an object. They don't include a lot of things like interior details. So on my hat here, if I'm talking about contours, I'm talking about the lines that make up the bowl of this hat. I'm talking about this line right here. I'm not worrying about, say, the hat band that goes around it. If this was, I don't know, a wicker hat, and it had all this detail from all of the wicker, that would not be contours. My contours are just these lines out here. Right? I'm going to go around those with my ruler and my pencil. And when I encounter a curve, I can't make a circle because the whole thing about this is we're using straight lines. So if I'm going to make a curve, I'm going to do so in a series of straight lines that will make that curve for me. All right? So, come in here. I'm going to go around this hat here. All right, and then I'll get the bowl, not the bowl, the brim of the hat. And again, I'm just doing this with a series of straight lines. If I need to go around a curve, I'm doing so with a series of connected straight lines that follow that curve. Like so. Again, not worrying about the band that goes around it, not worrying about any details of any texture that might be on it. Just getting the bowl of that hat in place and my lines that make up the brim of that hat. All right? Then, again, if I had more objects up here, I'd go around all of those objects doing the same thing, going around all of their contours. Then I go back to my 2B. Now, the reason I go back to my 2B for planes is because all my planes are going to be inside these marks that I've just made. And you need darker marks around the contours of objects to contain all this madness that's about to happen inside them. So if these lines in here can be a little lighter, it helps to not feel like it's all about to fly apart. And it doesn't become too confusing. All right, so now, I've got the bowl of that hat right there, which is a rounded object. Right now, it's just a flat plane. I need to break it up into some more planes to make that work and make it feel like something rounded that I can reach out and grab. So what I often say is I want you to try to imagine because you're standing away from the still life, so you can't actually reach out and touch the still life. But if you could, how would your hand move along that object? If you could reach out and touch it. And if I were to reach out and say, grab this way, right? My hand is going to curve like this, creating kind of a series of planes with my knuckle, where I've got one kind of big unforeshortened plane right here. I've got a foreshortened plane right there. I mean, unforeshortened, and then foreshortened there, which becomes smaller. And then another foreshortened plane that becomes even smaller. So that essentially what's happening, though it's my finger, right, is an unforeshortened plane, then a foreshortened plane that's becoming smaller, and then an even more foreshortened plane that's even smaller. If I were to reach around and grab that. That gives me the appearance of a curved surface. Then also, if I could reach out and I could grab that hat this way, right? My fingers are going to curve over it like that, and it's doing the same thing, only now on sort of a vertical axis, where I have an unforeshortened plane here that's larger. I have foreshortened plane here, smaller, and even more foreshortened plane up here that's even smaller, so that something like this is happening. Unforeshortened plane, foreshortened, smaller plane, even more foreshortened, even smaller plane. Again, giving me this impression of a surface that is curving away from me on a vertical axis. Think about it as well, like if you've ever looked at a globe. If you've ever looked at a globe, right, you have those longitude lines and those latitude lines that split that globe up in such a way that you have essentially large planes here in the middle that become smaller and more foreshortened as they move toward the top, and smaller and more foreshortened as they move from side to side. And the bowl of this hat is essentially just the top half of that globe. So what if I do a series of planes that sort of mimic that, but using straight lines? So I might do something like create a plane right here, that's fairly unforeshortened. I'm still thinking about the fact that it's going to need to curve inward, so I've pinched it in somewhat. And then give myself another one here that's a little smaller and more foreshortened than that. And here, even smaller and even more foreshortened. And then do the same thing over on this side. Right? That starts to give me this feeling of this being an object that's curving that direction. Right? But I want to continue this upward. So if I think about this way of doing things, perhaps I take this here and pinch this in a bit more to foreshorten it more and make it smaller than the one below it. And then I'll bring it up to a complete point at the top, here. That's giving me that illusion that this is curving away from me like so. And then I could just continue that along the way with these other planes, foreshortening them more as I go. Maybe I'm going to need to bring another plane in over here, or else that's not going to look as foreshortened as it needs to be, because they should be becoming smaller as they get out there toward the contours. Then I'm going to break that up there, bring these lines in as well. And you'll notice is as these lines, these essentially vertical lines that are curving away from me, get closer to that curved contour, they start to follow that contour more and more. All right, now that's already doing the trick. I got the sense of an object that I can reach out and grab this way. I can grab this way. It feels rounded. because these planes on the side are so foreshortened and so small, they give the feeling that they're curving around and going behind it. So now I've got that brim, which is already kind of doing the trick because that's a flat plane, and so is that. But maybe I want to enhance it just a bit more, because I could say to myself, well, I understand that it's closer to me here than it is back there. How can I portray that? Well, what if I just give myself a couple of simple lines here and here that take advantage of how perspective works and tell me that out here things are closer to me, and then they move inward like that. And then I could do the same thing back here, but take the line upward and away, back that direction, so that someone can understand that back there, that's also continuing to lie flat and move away from me in space. All right? That takes us through those first 3 steps. I would have done that for all of my objects out there. And then lastly, I'm going to think about my line variation by getting my 4B and my 6B out. And I can think about some things like, that's not what I want. Where's my 6B? One moment while I figure out where it went. There it is. I can think about things like, well, this part of the hat is closest to me. So what if I go really super dark here to push it closer to me in space? I could use these planes themselves, and I can go a little darker up here and then lift to give that line the sense of being closer to me here and moving away from me in space. I didn't do a very good job of lifting there. Let me see if I can smooth that out. I could put a darker line around this entire bowl of the hat so that the lines that go behind it feel like they're behind it, but nowhere near as dark as the lines I put up here. Then we talked about how we could take advantage, right? When we have something that's round, we can take advantage of how our eyes expect to see things by pushing one side of that round object darker than the other. I could do that same thing here, but I could bring that language into the planes themselves, which I'm just going to do by hand rather than with a ruler so I can speed up the process. Is that if I put darker lines around the planes on one side versus the other, and then sort of trail them as we come across, it gives me that illusion that this is lit on this side and the other side is in shadow. Right? If I had other objects, I'd think about my line variation with them. If I had objects that were really far away, I might just leave the lines the way that they were because they would already be thin and crisp. Now, one last thing I'm going to talk about, and then we'll get to work, is that sometimes, and you'll even see it in the examples that I have, that I just showed on the board, students get into what I call being plane happy. Because they'll have something that's either already planar, like a book, right? We already talked about the book. They'll have it all nice and lined out, making perfect sense, book. And then they'll just keep on breaking that up into even more planes. They just can't help themselves. Like, they get into it too much. And so they just start making lots and lots and lots and lots of planes on something that doesn't even need it. Right? Now, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but it was already planar, and what you had was already working. Doing all this has a tendency to create pattern and actually wants to flatten it because it makes it harder for me to see those divisions between planes. I've also seen things like, again, let's say we have a cylinder. And a student has done a great job of doing something like this, and they've created a cylinder. Okay. Now maybe another set of lines right here might help, just reinforce the sense of that being round. But then I'll have students who just can't help it. They just keep going and keep going and keep going, and they just end up splitting this thing up into so many planes, and they'll even maybe take the top and like break it up into a bunch of planes. And then, like I said, that has a tendency to want to flatten this object rather than making it feel like something that is solid and three-dimensional. So I get it, and I won't stop you if I see you making tons and tons of planes like this. I might point it out to you because I get some students just get into the fun of it and just keep going. But think about ways that you could simplify as opposed to tons and tons and tons of lines. So right now, I want you to go out there. I want you to find that portion of the still life that you're interested in drawing. Consider how, if you've got that grouping of 3 to 4 objects, it needs to fit on your page. Because I want you to include whatever's immediately surrounding it. So that if you draw it too small, that's more stuff you got to try to include. So think about whether your paper should be in portrait or landscape based on how the objects are arranged, and how big should you make them in order to make sure that they all fit on the page. Start out with that 2B sketchy first step where you're not worrying about your line quality. You're just thinking about getting your proportions, your perspective, and your placement correct. Start there.